Whew, give me the big coffee mug today. All right. You can sit or not sit, whatever feels comfortable. So I decided we'll do this week and next week, and then we'll take the 18th off. Is it the 18th? 18th, yeah. So we'll do today, and then next Sunday we'll wrap this up. And I also decided we will take January as a break as well, because we have the semi-annual meeting at the end of January, and then that gives me a chance to kind of like recharge and come up with fresh ideas. But the study that we're going to start at the beginning of February, which is going to lead all the way up through into Easter, or to Easter, up to Holy Week, will be the topic I talked about before, which is creating a gospel-based model of discipleship, which is a mouthful, and that sounds like a crazy topic. But essentially the idea is this, right? We have 2,000 years of accumulated baggage about what it means to define oneself as a Christian, which nothing wrong with that, right? That's tradition, that's all that stuff. But I think it would be fun to basically look at what Jesus did with the disciples and try to extrapolate what a very basic understanding of being a disciple might be in our modern context based off of that. Does that make sense? Right? Like looking at what specifically were they involved in? What, anyways. So we'll do that. And I think that will take about 2 months. That might be optimistic though. I tend to run long. So I think that will take us through February and March, which is great because then Easter is the second Sunday in April. So that'll take us right up to Palm Sunday.
So when is Easter?
April 2nd Sunday. Yeah. I'll tell you in a second here.
Isn't that late?
Nah, it's right in the middle. I think it's second Sunday. It might be first Sunday.
That's a little later.
Last year it was super late. The year before it was super early. Yes, April 9th. April 9th is Easter. And then we're going to Boston the following week, or the week after that. I can't remember. Yeah. Well, Elaine qualified for the Boston Marathon, so yeah. Never going to hear the end of this one, by the way. She beat my marathon time, which wasn't that amazing to begin with, but well, anyways.
That's great.
Yeah, so we're very excited. This will be my first time in Boston ever, and we have friends there. Yeah.
Well, forget a Boston accent. I'm surprised you don't have a French accent.
Yeah, as my wife would tell me, I don't speak enough French to. Oh oui, oui. All right. Okay, let's talk Leviticus, the most exciting stuff in the world. So recap. Okay, so thus far we have looked at ancient codes of ancient codes of law, right? So we looked at the code of Hammurabi. We looked at the code of Ibit Ishtar, whatever. We looked at the code of Ur-Nammu, which all kind of come from the same geographical region, which is ancient Assyria, Babylon, modern day Iraq. Okay, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the breadbasket of the Middle East. So it's not shocking that these places, which had a lot of food, were very successful and wealthy in an ancient measurement of that. Also were places that developed the fastest in terms of what we kind of look at as signs of civilization, right? Code of laws, building infrastructure. In fact, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, if you're looking at it from a sociological, anthropological standpoint, it is not shocking that this was kind of the seat of the major power in the world during that time, because they had natural resources, right? And they had access to the sea, which meant access to trade, all kinds of stuff. So these ancient city-states, which eventually get absorbed into the Assyrian Empire and later the Babylonian Empire, are the places where we get kind of a peek at what ancient legal codes looked like. Then we looked at the foundations of what becomes the quote-unquote biblical law, which is the law that's given to Moses during the Exodus, right? And the story that goes along with that is the story of, obviously, the Hebrew people's flight from Egypt, their wandering in the wilderness, and then the development of what eventually becomes the nation of Israel, which that's a very long process. And we talked about how, I think we talked about this, but again, the infancy stages of what we refer to as, what eventually becomes the kingdom of Israel was really just a bunch of connected tribes, 12 in total. And I don't remember the names of all of them. I remember Benjamin because he's the youngest, but they're all named after the 12 sons of Jacob, right? Judah becomes the largest and most successful of the tribes, okay? And Judah is what remains after Assyria conquers the northern kingdom, right? So it's really the tribe of Judah that continues in perpetuity. So these 12 connected tribes, really, if you think about it, what united them was a common sense of identity, right? A sense of identity that is built during the Exodus time, right? The core of which is that they are a people who fled slavery, so experienced some trauma in their history. But there are people also who, in their minds, were returning to the land that they came from, but also, and this is that sense of divine destiny, the land that was promised to them. We see how that works its way into the legal code, right? In the language that follows the golden calf experience, right? There's one of part of the renewing of the covenant is God saying to Moses, and you will drive out these peoples who currently occupy that land. Kind of troublesome. There's a movie that just came out. I haven't seen it yet. I just read about it this morning. That's on Netflix. It's either right now or will be on Netflix soon, which details, what's the name of it? It details what happened in 1948 when the Palestinians were driven from their homes in Israel. So, this still has impacts in today's day and age because the modern nation that is Israel pulls from that same identity, pulls from that same sense of this land was our land since forever, but it's also the land that was promised to us by God. And so that creates a lot of the conflict that we see in modern day and age. And the reason I mention this is you can't separate that identity from the law, the code of laws that the Hebrew people also base their identity on. We see that very much in the descriptions of how they manage their land, right? And one of the pieces that works its way through, that's part of the reestablished covenant following the golden calf experience, is a reminder that the land technically belongs to God, and so you leave 10% for the poor and for the wild animals. But then also it's this re-emphasis that you need to share from the things that you derive from the land. So you give to the temple, right? Because this is the way that the temple is supported. So where all this is leading is to a description of what Leviticus comes out of, okay? So we see Leviticus. Leviticus is part of what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis and Exodus are the two that are mostly narrative, right? So Genesis describes, it's myth-telling, it's a bunch of stuff, but if you're thinking of it as a chronological narrative, it describes a large chunk of time, all the way from the, quote-unquote, creation of the universe up through the Joseph experience, right? Up through the Hebrew people arriving in Egypt. Then Exodus takes over, and Exodus describes all the way, about a couple hundred years after the end of Genesis, describes the people leaving Egypt, heading into the wilderness, the years of wandering, and then stops just before the people cross into the promised land. The narrative doesn't pick back up again until Joshua, right? So we have these three books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that exist kind of in this weird place, okay? Numbers is referred to as such because it has a lot of numbers. Numbers kicks off with a description of the census of the tribes of what eventually become Israel. Okay, there's other stuff in there as well too. Deuteronomy has some narrative in it. The end of Deuteronomy describes the death of Moses and basically sets the stage then for Joshua, who becomes the new leader of the tribes of Israel, to come in and take that leadership role. But the actual possession of the land of that becomes Israel doesn't take place until the book of Joshua, right? That's where we get, Joshua and the, walls of Jericho and Rahab and all those interesting stories. So what's Leviticus about? Leviticus is about the temple, okay? Exodus generally describes in its law-giving civil society, right? How you deal with conflict in the neighborhood, economic justice, how, again, it's a strange concept to us, but how slavery functions, and do slaves have rights in that society? And we talked last week about how there's this progressive element that exists there that is the year of Jubilee, which says that every 7 years slaves are freed and debts are forgiven. We talked about how that's important and how God, the voice of God reminds the people, to keep these festivals and to remember these things, right? Leviticus is all about the temple and the priests. The reason it's called Leviticus is because the priests who were and this is a kind of a new thing for the ancient world, who were people who dedicated their entire lives to the caretaking of the temple, okay? They gave themselves to the church, right? We're not celibate, not necessarily. That's complicated. And so I don't want to conflate that with like a Catholic understanding of a priest. But there are some corollaries there. So the book of Leviticus sets in place what it means to be a Levite, but also what's the temple supposed to look like? I mean, it gets into really crazy detail too, like how big it is, how it's supposed to be decorated, how you lay out the interior, right? So you've got the bread of presence, you've got the curtain that separates the tabernacle from the courtyard, and all of these interesting things. And if you have ever read through Leviticus, it's really easy to get bored out of your mind because you're reading stuff that sounds like an architectural manual. What it also lays out is it lays out the religious practices, the rituals of the Hebrew people. So like, if you've got a Bible in front of you, you can flip to chapter 1. We're just skimming through. We're just looking at titles. We're not necessarily reading anything. But right from the beginning, right, title number 1 is the burnt offering. This concept is not originated in Leviticus. It actually comes from the law giving in Exodus, where part of it is you shall give your firstborn to me, right? So a natural question is, well, what does that look like? What does it mean, again from an ancient mindset, to give the firstborn of our herd to God? Well, Leviticus details exactly what that means. A good way to think of Leviticus is actually the bylaws of a church. Something that Matt and I are working on right now. We're in the process of updating our constitution, and then we'll soon be looking at the bylaws of the congregation. In other words, the governing documents that describe what the worship practices of a community are. That's what Leviticus is about. I'm telling you all this because I think this is a framework that a lot of us don't have access to. This was never really explained to us. But it also kind of creates a place for what Leviticus is about, right? And the reason this is important is because there are also some uncomfortable things in Leviticus, right? Things that, laws that describe sexual propriety and impropriety, things which have been dredged up as justifications for arguments before or against specific things, which have caused a lot of conflict in our modern world. One of the things I always point to is that these were sacred practices, right? These were laws that described the religious practices of a specific people. They weren't necessarily meant to be universal laws. Does that make sense? Right? They were meant for the people of Israel as they related to the institution that was their church. And this might be semantics, but it's kind of important semantics because it's important to differentiate that from the relationship of the people directly to God. Okay? Because that's more what Exodus describes. We get this interesting narrative description of literal interactions between the divine and the people via Moses. Leviticus is about how you relate to the temple, okay? So when we talked about the laws of Moses, one of the things that we talked about was how the Ten Commandments kind of establishes this foundation, but then the successive laws that come are interpretations in many ways of how you might apply the fundamentals that are established in the Ten Commandments. A way to think of Leviticus is that at the heart of it, you can imagine that, well, not imagine, the heart of Leviticus is the first and second commandments, right? I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, okay? That is the foundation for what comes out of Leviticus. So in other words, it's the foundation for how people relate to the divine. You can also throw the Sabbath and onto the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's definitely part of what inspires Leviticus. But Leviticus is an application of that covenantal language, right? I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. In the same way that some of the later laws in Exodus are applications of this foundational Ten Commandment stuff, like you shall not covet your neighbor's anything, you shall not murder, you shall not lie, you shall not, bear false witness. Does that make sense? So again, this is a rather long introduction, but Leviticus is weird, okay? It's weird and it's long and it's boring and it's really easy to take things that we don't fully understand and take them out of their context and use them inappropriately. Okay? This happens all the time, not just with the Bible. This happens all the time. My wife, Ellen, was dealing with this recently. So part of her job, so she manages the clean room, which is like 200,000 square feet of space. So part of her job is dealing with vendors. So people that are not directly employed by Intel, but provide services and resources to Intel, right? And so that's one of her least favorite parts of the job. Well, it depends which vendor she's dealing with, because they are a customer of Intel, right? Well, Intel is a customer of them. So it's one of these interesting contractual relationships. So the other day she was, and I can tell when she's ticked off because I come upstairs and I hear her yelling at her computer. No, she doesn't yell. She speaks firmly. She speaks firmly as a French person would, which sometimes can be conflated with yelling. Anyways, I knew that she was stressed, and so she came out and we were having lunch, and I, made the mistake of asking her what was going on. And what had happened is that, she puts together essentially what are process manuals for a bunch of the facets of things that she oversees. So it's basically a document that describes, the rules and regulations regarding the filtration system, right? Well, the vendors will sometimes need to access that material because, she's saying, I need a filter that does this. And she'll say, and so here is what I'm working from so that I can help you understand exactly what I need you to make, right? What had happened was that one of the vendors had gotten access to one of these documents, which isn't necessarily wrong, but they started reading through it and didn't understand what they were reading. and started quoting back pieces to her, arguing what she wanted them to do. And she's like, no. Number one, I wrote this document. Don't you dare quote it back to me like I'm some ignoramus. But number two, you don't understand what you're reading. Just trust me when I know what I want from you. Don't second guess what I'm doing. In the same way, right, we can sometimes take things that are big, long, and confusing and have a very specific context, and we can take a piece out because we think that we understand it. And maybe we understand that one sentence, or we think we do, but it loses its meaning, or its meaning gets perverted when we take it out of the context into which it exists. Leviticus has a specific context. It's about the relationship between the people of Israel and the temple. By connection, it's also about their relationship with God, but it's about that relationship via the Levitical priesthood. So again, if you just kind of skim through here, chapter 1, burnt offerings, chapter 2, grain offerings, are any of these practices that we really have in our not really. I mean, I'm not burning any calves on the altar. There are so many building violations that we, I doubt our flame suppressant system. There's no flame suppressant system in the sanctuary, so that's problem number one. But no, I mean, and I'm being snarky, but really think about it. I mean, are any of these practices that we necessarily do? You could make the argument that there are corollaries. Like you can make the argument that money that is donated to the church or donated to any of our causes is a perhaps a metaphorical comparison, a corollary to a burnt offering or a grain offering. And we use that language, right? I mean, you might notice in our prayers that we get from our parent denomination, you will hear language like in our burnt offerings and our grain offerings, but it's metaphor, because none of our churches, I can say this with confidence, none of our churches are burning animal sacrifices. In fact, I really hope that there aren't any churches in America that are burning animal sacrifices, but you never rule anything out. Only if they're having a barbecue. That's an interesting theological paper right there, Linda. Because tailgating, right? Tailgating is the modern burnt offering. That's right. I'm right. That's mine. I'm claiming that one. I'm writing that paper.
We consume it. I don't think they consume it, do
they? Very important distinction, Gail. Yes. And as you read through this is also one of the important things. There's an asterisk there, okay? The things that are given as a burnt offering to the temple are not to be consumed by the general populace. However, a portion of those animal sacrifices goes to the Levitical priesthood, right? So this is this wonderful mechanism by which a professional priesthood can support themselves, was that a portion of this stuff then goes to them. Here are questions that I don't know the answers to. Like, if you gave a cow, did they just take 10% of the cow and eat that? Or were 10 cows given and the Levites get one of them, right? I think those are important questions because when we eventually get to the sons of Elisha, is it? Who are the ones? I think it's the sons of Elisha. No, it's not Elisha or Elijah. It's the sons of one of the prophets later on are found to be corrupt. And the specific thing that they're doing that is corrupted is that they are skimming off the top, right? Not money, but they're taking things that were dedicated to the temple for themselves. Okay. But burnt offerings, grain offerings, these are all ways by which the people of Israel relate to the temple. If you look for, and again, I'm just going to read a couple of passages here. So, I'm in chapter 2 of Leviticus. I mean, and it's really interesting from a kind of sociological standpoint, right? When you present a grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be of choice flour. So none of that second, handoff, whatever. What's that? Ellen wanted to make garlic naan, and she used some weird rye flour, and it did not come out well. Anyways, it has to be the right flour. Yeah, no, we don't have any gluten-free flour in our house. Maybe we should. Unleavened cakes mixed with oil or unleavened wafers spread with oil. If your offering is grain prepared on a griddle, it shall be of choice flour mixed with oil, unleavened. This is basically You know, the baker's handbook here, right? This has nothing to do with righteousness or relationship with God. These are really detailed instructions of how to break, or how to bake sacrificial bread, right? So again, when we read the laws of Leviticus, you can't quote Leviticus 18 and not quote Leviticus 2, right? Even though they're dealing with very separate things. Okay, chapter 3 is offerings of well-being, and one of the things is notice the language. It always references sacrifice, even you know when they're talking about baked offering, grain offerings, it's a sacrifice, which carries with it connotation, right? When we think sacrifice, when I think sacrifice, I think Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, right? Anybody else's brain goes, okay. I'm dating myself, I guess, which is as a young one that what, anyways. But I'm thinking some dude with a knife, cutting the heart out of a person on an altar. Maybe I'm twisted, I don't know. But we think sacrifice as being, a living thing. Well, yes, it is a living thing, but sacrifice isn't about the act. It's about the sacredness of the thing. Okay, so let me just really quickly unpack that. We can use sacrifice as a verb in English, right? But sacrifice, at least in a Levitical understanding, is not about the giving of the thing. It's about the thing that is now sacred, or in other words, set apart. Okay, and you will see in the language, it's because it is set apart for God. Okay, that is the foundational understanding of what sacrifice is. You even see this play out in one of the more troubling texts in Genesis, the sacrifice of Isaac, right? Which could be argued as just a basic misunderstanding, a mistranslation between Abraham and God. You can have Isaac be a sacrifice and not have to cut Isaac's heart out with a knife, right? And to be fair, this is language that eventually works its way into the Levitical language, is that the Levites are sacrifices to God. They are children of Israel who have set their lives apart specifically for service at the temple. Does that track, right? That's what this is about. A sacrifice is a sacred thing. When we bring the offering and set it on the altar, we use the same language. That offering is a sacrifice that is set apart for God, right? The bread and the wine are that we're getting into more deep theological stuff here, but the bread and the wine are a sacrifice set apart for us, all right? But that we're not going to do Christology today. That's for March. but again, so these are all of the things that come up. By the time we get to chapter 4, we start to get into a little bit more nuanced conversation, which is sin offerings. Okay? Prior to this, all of these things are part of the regular rhythm of religious practice in Israel. These are things that you're doing on a regular basis. They're things that you're doing for the different festivals that they're asked to remember and to celebrate. They are things that they might be doing as part of their weekly or monthly, worship. Again, keep in mind this is an era sans motorized vehicles. So if you are going to Jerusalem, it takes you a long time to get there, depending on how far away you're coming from. So the people living in Jerusalem might go to the temple on a regular basis, but the people that are living in other places are participating. Well, this is cloudy, okay? At what point in Hebrew practice do synagogues or local temples arise, which are essentially extensions of the big temple? It's a whole other conversation. That's a question I don't really know the answer to. I should ask my friends Ann and Ryan about that one. But my point being that these grain offerings, these burnt offerings, are things that you might be doing when you're coming for Yom Kippur, right? When you're coming for the Festival of Atonement or something like that. Sin offerings are specific and subjective is the word I'm looking for. Okay. So a sin offering is an offering that is made when you have broken something. You have harmed somebody. Okay. For example, The Lord spoke, I'm reading right from the beginning of chapter 4. When the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, when anyone sins, underline, unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, semicolon, that semicolon does not exist in the original Hebrew text. Okay, there's no punctuation at all. But semicolon, because this is to help us understand that everything that follows then is an extension of this case. If anyone sins unintentionally, here's what you do. And then we get 3 through 12 being a description of what you do. And it's kind of weird, right? For example, you're supposed to bring a bull to the temple without blemish, in the same way that you're supposed to use choice flour. This is supposed to be a bull without blemish. You lay it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Now, wait a second. The tent of meeting, there is no tent of meeting in Jerusalem in the tabernacle. So, what this says is that this section, at least, originally dates from when the people are in the wilderness, heading, during the exile, or during Exodus, sorry, okay? That doesn't necessarily negate its importance for later religious practices, but again, I talked about the importance of understanding the context of where these laws come. This is a practice that was originally, that derives from when the people are wandering around. Here's another thing that it's interesting to think about. Again, talking about the mobility of the people during, can you imagine the herds of animals that they had along with them, right? Which require intense amounts of grazing land in order to feed, right? Does that change our perspective on what it means to be in the wilderness a little bit? They're not wandering around in the Sahara for 40 years. Anyways, that's a non sequitur, but okay. He shall bring the bull to the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord and lay his hand on the head of the bull. The bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. The anointed priest shall take some of the blood of the bull and bring it into the tent of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain of the sanctuary. The priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense that is in the tent of meeting before the Lord, and the rest of the blood of the bull he shall pour at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Wow, that's some really descriptive, intense stuff, right? That is not just carving out a heart with a knife. Again, sorry to be so graphic, but this has a lot of stuff behind it, right? This is a very complex ritual that they're performing, and it goes on. He shall remove all the fat from the bull of the sin offering, the fat that covers the entrails and all the fat that's around the entrails, the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them at the loins, and the appendage of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys, just as these are removed from the ox, the sacrifice of well-being. This is a rather intense understanding of bull anatomy. The priest shall turn them into smoke upon the altar of burnt offering, but the skin of the bull and all its flesh, as well as its head, its legs, its entrails, and its dung, all the rest of the bull he shall carry out to a clean place outside the camp, to the ash heap, and shall burn it on a wood of fire. At the ash heap it shall be burnt. This is weird. This is really weird. But notice that the only things that are burnt offerings to God are the blood and the fat. Everything else goes out to the ash heap. Isn't that fascinating? We're not going to figure this out today, and I don't know that you can figure it out. But again, my inquisitive mind is like, why? I mean, fat's okay. It carries the flavor in cooking. But I don't eat fat. Like, I don't just cut off a chunk of fat, and oh, that's delicious. Apparently God loves it though. but again, we can read way too much meaning into this. And perhaps there are actual contextual reasons why the Hebrew people might have thought that the fat was the most valuable part, right? What? Yeah. It's the only part that's a good point, Andy. That's a good point. The only part that's going to easily burn, right? Because I use pork fat all the time when I'm cooking stuff, pork fat, duck fat, whatever I happen to have, Now I sound like really bougie or something like that. I want to use duck fat in my potatoes. But yeah, fat dissolves in the pan and it will catch on fire. Grease fires are terrifying. Never want to experience that.
Could this have been a continuation of the practice of the Canaanites with their god Baal?
Could be. And this is great thinking, Paula, because again, in our modern retrospect regarding biblical times, we have created a distinction that I'm not sure exists, which is this really firm line between the Hebrew people and everyone else. Like, well, these were the chosen people, and they did everything special, and everybody else was different. And again, where this manifests is when you get into like the Book of Kings, and you hear stories about, the people turned to other gods, as if it's like an intentional thing, like, I'm done with Yahweh, I'm going to try this guy on for size for a couple of months. When in fact, there was much more cultural interplay that went on between the people of Israel and the people of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt and Lebanon. And I mean, there's a lot of movement between this. And what happens with movement of peoples is you have movement of cultures and practices, right? So yes, I think you're absolutely right, Paula.
I'm surprised they didn't use the hide and stuff more practically, though. For clothing.
This is an interesting question, but this is the point. This is the point, is that it's a sacrifice. You are giving up something that has value, right? God doesn't want, again, in quotes here, God, according to Leviticus, doesn't want you to give your cast-offs. You are to make a sacrifice of the choicest flour and an unblemished calf or bull, right? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the same extent, and repeat yourself, sorry. Unblemished animals in plural. The same extends as well to leaving the gleanings of the field, right? You're not supposed to leave the rotten pumpkins or whatever, right? At least the language that's in Exodus seems to indicate that you leave an even 10% of the field for the poor and the wild animals, right? Because that's what you do, right? And it's fun to think about applying this into our context, right? You can get into the weeds really quickly here, but this idea of sacrifice is in a lot of ways the foundation for a tax system, right? Right? It is resources of the individual that are contributed for the good of the community. In this case, for the good of the professional priesthood and as a sacrifice to God. But one of the underlying intents there is that this is something that we do collectively for the good of the whole, right? It's complicated. As you get into theodicy, right? Like, again, the Hebrew people have very firm ideas about the agency of God, right? Like if something bad happens, God did it, right? So making sure that you do your sacrifices on a regular basis is a way that you make sure that God doesn't do bad things. We don't operate, hopefully, on that same wavelength. That was kind of where their mind was, because that's where everybody's mind was. That was an ancient understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human, right? You appeased the divine in order to avoid the consequences, right? Which describes much more the relationship of the Greeks with their deities or demi-deities. Okay, I'm getting off topic. Okay, so blood offering, burnt offering, fat. Also, fat actually has great value because when you go to the grocery store, perhaps, and you look at cuts of beef, right? What are the catchphrases now? Wagyu. What's the other? Kobe, right? Angus, right? Which are valued because of the marbling of fat in it. Fat carries flavor. Fat contributes lots of things. When you're in a scarcity society, which most of the ancient world is, to have the luxury to gain fat on either a labor animal or your own body is a symbol of wealth and prosperity, right?
What kind of oil did they use in lamps?
That's a really good question. It's in Leviticus. It says exactly which oil you're supposed to use. So I know that two that were used regularly were tallow and olive oil, right? Because these are two sources that you have at hand. Tallow. Yeah. But I'm not an expert on the civil practices.
Corollary or so if handling dead animals was unclean.
Oh yeah, okay.
Who made candles, or did they use leather? Did they make leather?
Absolutely. Hides become the writing material. I mean,
Oh, sure, sheepskin.
and this is, and again, we are getting beyond my concrete knowledge here, but, and again, if you go through all of the uncleanliness issues in Leviticus, there's a reason why they have such rigid descriptions of how you become clean again, right? So again, women during that time of the month have to go through a purification process. Warriors returning from battle go through a purification process. They have touched blood, right, and done violence, both of which are unclean practices. Here's something to think about as well. So, what is the worst smelling practice of ancient society? Processing and tanning animal hides. We talked about this, right? Because the original way that they made what eventually becomes vellum and other stuff was bathing it in urine, right? The acid breaks down the animal fiber. So can you imagine being somebody that tans hides and does other stuff? You stink. So obviously, the first thing they're going to do when they come to the temple is the priest is going to tell them to take a ritual bath. Again, yeah, you're probably single too, right? Maybe. So, and this is fun to imagine about, is because one of the questions that always pops in my head is how much of these ritual practices have practical roots to them? And we certainly do that work of trying to connect ritual practices with practical roots. We did this when we were walking through Exodus, right? Of like, why this thing or why that thing? Perhaps it comes out of this. Why is it forbidden to boil a kid in its mother's milk? What's the origin of that? And why is it mentioned twice in Exodus? Yeah.
But disease come into
Could be.
I
Could
understood
be.
about disease and where-
Shellfish, straight up forbidden, right? Pork, straight up forbidden. Things of a cloven hoof. Trichinosis is a real thing. In a pre-refrigerative, that's not a word, but in a world pre-ice and you're in the desert, right? So the ways in which they preserve meat are smoking and drying and or salt, yeah, curing, yeah. Yeah. Which when we went to Norway, right? You can only do this up in the Arctic Circle is all of the fish that they fished, they would just hang and let dry, right? And this was a staple, a part of their diet, because you would turn it into soups and stocks, and you could rehydrate the fish and eat it, which I'm sure was absolutely disgusting. I did not want to try it. But yes, Angie. I've had it and never will again. I'm a texture person. I really don't have any flavors that I dislike, but man, there are textures that would just set me off. Yeah. Lutefisk, for the uninitiated, is fish that has been cured in lye, which is not a digestible material. We use lye for cleaning. Anyways, okay. I did want to read one thing. Okay, so we read the description for the whole congregation of Israel. That was the whole blood sacrifice. What might fall into that category of the whole congregation of Israel sinning? What does that look like? There's no concrete answer here, by the way. This is imagining here. What does it look like for the whole congregation of Israel to sin? Golden calf incident, does that fall into that category?
What?
Golden calf incident?
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, is it interesting then that the thing that you sacrifice is a bull? Again, one of the things that we see throughout these writings is the divine using reminders, right? So what happens when the people are questioning God after the manna, and what does God send into the camp to plague the people? Snakes, right? And then the people complain about the snakes, and so God says to Moses, take one of the snakes, impale it on a staff, put that staff in the, or no, he asks him to make it out of bronze, I think. Make a snake out of bronze, put it in the midst of the camp, and when you get bitten by a snake, come and look at the snake, be reminded of your sin, and you shall be cured. Right? So one of the mechanisms by which people are asked to repent is by a reminder of what they did wrong in the first place. So if the whole congregation sins, whatever that means, I imagine that they were doing the sacrifice when things went poorly, right? Crops are failing, God must be ticked at us. Let's do a bull sacrifice. But the golden calf was the initial incident. Now you're burning bulls.
But to sacrifice a bull out of your herd is a big deal.
Yeah, that totally is. Because for the same reason that inheritance is so important to the people of Israel, a bull is what makes other cows. Well, it's more complicated than that. but yeah, bull. Yeah. Do I need to go into detail here? Okay. Where's the veterinarian? Andrew.
To be a little bit more, it could be a situation where the Levites are hungry.
Yes. And again, this is where my brain goes too, is like, how many of these congregational sacrifices were because the Levites wanted steak for dinner? Right? I don't know.
They couldn't eat it.
Yes, they do.
The Levites.
But this is what I was talking about, right? When you make sacrifice, do you get 10% of the one cow, or do you sacrifice 10 cows and one of them goes to the Levites? And it's complicated, okay? The provision for that is not in this text, but it comes later. Okay, but one thing I want to call attention to, okay, so that's the whole congregation. Then if you jump down to verse 22, when a ruler sins, and we're not talking about a unit of measurement, we're talking about king or a tribal leader. Again, doing, underline, unintentionally any one of all the things that by commandments of the Lord his God not ought to be done, incurs guilt, etc., male goat. Okay, so whole congregation, bull, ruler, male goat. Again, we're keeping with the male theme here. Okay, without blemish. Similar description, except now that they've summarized it a little bit, because this is the second occurrence, right? So you take some of the blood, finger, puts it in the horns, pours it at the base of the altar. Fat goes onto the altar, and then I imagine that everything else goes onto the ash pile, except it doesn't say that it goes onto the ash pile in this case. So are we to assume that it goes into the ash pile, or perhaps the Levites said, no, we get the rest of the goat, right? You see where this works its way in here, right? Okay. And then I love this, and I really should have looked at what the original Hebrew word is here. If any one of the ordinary people, so not one of the special people, but of the ordinary people, sins, etc., a female goat without blemish is your offering. Same description, and again, does not describe what you do with the remains of the female goat after the blood and the fat have been extracted. Verse 32. If the offering you bring as a sin offering is a sheep, you shall bring a female without blemish. Exact same process. So, what we have here is the first ever recorded asterisk, which is, what happens if I don't have a female goat, right? I'm a shepherd, not a goat herd. And I'm sure Aaron got that question a lot, right? Like, I don't have any goats, dude. Fine, a sheep will do. Brian, write that down in the law. Do you see how this, yeah. But this is our holy book, right? Okay, how much time we got? It's 20 after. We're going to go a few more minutes. Just kind of like skimming, looking at what's happening here. What we get then in chapter 5 is, again, more specific application. So, for example, when any of you sin in that you have heard a public adjuration to testify, though able to testify as one who's seen or learned of the matter, but do not speak up, you are subject to punishment. So specific application in that case, or when you touch any unclean thing, and become unclean in the process, or when you touch human uncleanliness, examples of which we just described, or when you give a rash oath, when you swear, perhaps, when you realize that you've done this thing, okay, then you shall, as penalty for the sin, bring a female of the flock, a sheep or goat. Okay? So again, these are specific cases, specific applications of the thing. And notice the or, right? If you look at modern legal documents, you'll see similar stuff of like it could be this or this or this or this or this, right? And you can add more ors, not ORs, as more cases arise.
I like the comment
When you realize it. Oh man, and this is a fascinating conversation to have, right? This is a fascinating conversation to have, is because it says that, and again, this is part of the mechanism, right? Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is when you come and you make restitution for all of the things that you have done over the course of the year, which involves restitution with people that you have harmed. And how many times have you had something where you felt justified in the moment, and after the fact said, maybe I was in the wrong there. Or maybe I still think I'm in the right, but I realize it's better to be in the wrong and heal this rift than to continue on in my self-righteousness. What I've left undone. Yes. Go.
What is an unclean swarming? That's
Creepy crawlies. And which of these fall under that? All of them. I don't know.
That's chapter 5, verse 2.
Yeah. Or when you touch any unclean thing, whether the carcass of an unclean beast, the carcass of unclean livestock, or the carcass of an unclean swarming thing. Here's where my brain goes: it's the insects that accumulate around a dead carcass, right? So even though you didn't touch the carcass directly, if any of the flies get on you from the maggots or whatever, could be. But again, my wondering is how was that extrapolated, right? Because I'm sure somebody asked the question, well, I didn't touch it. I wasn't near a carcass, but I had a bunch of flies in my house last night. Does that mean that I need to do restitution, right? That comes up. This is why, the Hebrew people pioneered fly strips. I made that up. That is a complete lie. Do not.
Do you think this is
what holds it much restitution?
Oh, I don't have any goats though. I'm not giving up my dogs.
So way down the line, is this where confessions come in?
Absolutely. And what's really cool about this is we are seeing the evolution of how you relate to the temple, right? Not just within the Hebrew tradition, but as humanity and our circumstances changes. Because so where does the practice of confession come out of? It comes out of the Middle Ages Catholic Church, right? Which dives into more of these questions of, around how do we navigate sin, confession, and forgiveness with regards to God? What are the things that are sins? How do I make atonement for those things? And so we come up with mechanisms by which to make this happen, right?
The Catholic priest probably didn't want to deal with burning dead animals.
Oh, heck no.
Yeah, so they would just take the animal, go eat it, and then tell whoever sinned, okay, you got to say 10 Hail Marys or whatever.
Yeah. And humans are really good at turning these things into concrete processes, which is how you arrive at the justification of, well, we've got 30 monks in Toulouse that are praying 12 hours a day, and that's a lot of accumulated prayer time, meaning that technically we own that as the church, which could be leveraged as a resource for people that need to be able to make propitiation for their sins. What's the going rate for monk prayer time? I don't know, maybe 5. This is where indulgences come from. Sorry, that was a esoteric monologue that I had there. Sorry, I probably lost all you guys there. But again, this is what we do. And again, the underlying question is, where do we kind of like set the line between this is a human practice that we have developed in order to navigate our relationship with our institution, our church, and our relationship with God. But perhaps this is something that God doesn't necessarily desire from us. Perhaps this is a hang-up that we have. Perhaps this is a mechanism that we use, but is not necessarily divinely established, right? Hence, Leviticus, right? And again, this does not, we'll wrap up here. Next week, we'll get into more fun stuff.
But evidently they didn't like raw meat either.
No, because raw meat, right, carries all kinds of stuff. Yeah. Did they eat their steak rare or or well done? Yeah, I know. I mean these are valid questions. Hey, right there, and this comes later. And here's a really fun question to ask. Did the priests who were scattering the blood then have to themselves be cleansed afterwards? It's pretty, it's intense.
Well, it makes you understand a little bit the way they were bleeding animals in that day too.
When they were bleeding animals, absolutely. This is where both kosher and halal practices come from. Is a prohibition against touching blood. So you bleed the blood from the animal, but you could argue that these practices, what are now essentially civil practices, are actually derived from original sacrificial practices. Absolutely fascinating.
It's also how the escape clause for Shylock in Merchant of Venice, that whoever he owes something to can have a pound of flesh, but no blood.
You have completely redefined a pound of flesh for me now. Oh boy, you've totally messed with my train of thought. I'm never gonna see that in the same way anymore. Pound of flesh or without the blood. Okay, so for next week, like I said, we're gonna wrap things up next week. We're not gonna be able to do a totally in-depth reading of Leviticus. But next week we're going to jump to 11, which is clean and unclean foods. We're going to spend a little bit of time with that, and then we are going to do the following chapters as much as we can, because this is when we get into the really fun stuff like purification after childbirth, leprosy, varieties and symptoms. Yeah, real great stuff. And then finally, purification practices. So thanks, Jim, go for it.
Next week, would it be possible to touch on what the current Jewish practices is versus what it's a big question, but there's a whole range of the cultural Jews and the practicing Jews. But I mean, it'd be interesting.
You know what would be better than that would be, I mentioned, was it last week or the week before, that I have two friends that are in the process of converting to Judaism, would be to get their take on that, because I'm sure that stuff is fresh in their brain. I'll reach out to them. I can't promise that I'll get feedback by next week, but that might be something that we can look at down the road. And this is something that we've committed to before, is that we've had interfaith speakers come in. We've never really taken an in-depth look at Judaism as a whole. We talked about Buddhism, we talked about Islam. We didn't really spend a lot of time with, and I think that might be a future study as well too, understanding modern Judaism in all of its forms. Because it's, yeah.
So are they well known in the Bible as Christians? I mean, are they?
They are both they both went to Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and have their doctorates through that. One started out from a Christian basis. And I can't remember if Ryan was a church person or not. But it's complex. And it's not shocking to me. They have spent so much of their lives immersed in the Hebrew Bible that I'm not surprised at all that this has gained primary importance for them. Yeah. Be interesting to hear their perspective, though. Okay, folks. Thanks for your time. Thanks for participating. Next week, same bat time, same bat channel.